If you stand on the banks of the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan, just a few miles west of Detroit, you can feel the weight of history in the soil. The water moves slowly here, dark and heavy, cutting through the clay of the Midwest. And hidden behind acres of dense, tangled woodlands and iron gates stands a structure that defines the American century more than the White House or the Capitol building. It is a fortress of limestone that looks less like a home and more like a mausoleum for a living god. This is Fair Lane. It is a massive, severe building designed to resemble the Scottish castles of old Europe. But it wasn't built by a duke or a prince. It was built by a mechanic. It was built by the man who single-handedly dragged the world into the modern age. It was built by Henry Ford. On a cold night in 1915, the lights of Fair Lane flickered to life for the first time. But these weren't ordinary lights connected to a city grid. Henry Ford didn't trust the city. He didn't trust the government, and he certainly didn't trust other people to provide his power. Deep within the estate, connected to the main house by a damp, 300-foot tunnel, was a massive, 4-story powerhouse. It was a cathedral of industry, designed with the help of his best friend, Thomas Edison. Inside, pristine turbines hummed with a terrifying efficiency, generating enough electricity to power a small town. This powerhouse tells you everything you need to know about the man who lived here. Fair Lane was not built for pleasure. It wasn't built for parties, or for champagne, or for the jazz music that Henry Ford despised. It was built for control. It was a self-sufficient kingdom where the richest man in the world could rule as an absolute monarch, safe from the chaotic modern world he had helped create. To understand the darkness that would eventually consume this family, you first have to grasp the sheer, terrifying scale of the empire Henry Ford built. Before Ford, the automobile was a toy for the rich. It was a handcrafted luxury, as expensive as a house. Henry Ford looked at that and saw inefficiency. He didn't want to build a car for the elite. He wanted to build a car for everyone. He introduced the moving assembly line, a mechanism of such ruthless efficiency that it changed the rhythm of human life forever. By the 1920s, the Ford Motor Company wasn't just a business. It was a superpower. The River Rouge complex, located just down the river from his mansion, was the largest industrial complex in human history. It had its own steel mills, its own glass factories, its own police force, and its own deep-water port. Iron ore went in one end, and a finished car came out the other every 49 seconds. Henry Ford was the richest man in the world. He had more money than the U.S. Treasury. He was more famous than the president. In the deepest jungles of Brazil and the remote villages of Russia, people knew the name Ford. But inside the stone walls of Fair Lane, the atmosphere was not one of triumph. It was one of suffocation. Henry Ford was a genius, yes, but he was also a man of deep, disturbing contradictions. He built the future, yet he hated the modern world. He hated banks. He hated cities. He hated the very changes his cars had unleashed upon America. He wanted the world to look like the quiet, rural farm he grew up on, but he had paved over that farm with asphalt. He was a simple country boy who had become an industrial emperor, and that conflict tore him apart. He retreated into Fair Lane, creating a bubble where time stood still. He filled the estate with bird sanctuaries and rustic cabins, trying to recreate the 19th century. But he ruled it with the iron fist of the 20th. The servants at Fair Lane walked on eggshells. The staff knew that Mr. Ford was watching. He would appear silently in doorways, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. He demanded absolute simplicity, yet lived in a castle. He preached the virtue of hard work, yet he had the power to destroy a man's livelihood with a single word. But the real tragedy of Fairlane wasn't about factories or money. It was about a father and a son. In the shadow of this industrial titan stood a young man named Edsel Ford. He was Henry's only child. He was the prince of the empire, and he was everything his father was not. If Henry was the rough stone of the foundation, Edsel was the polished glass of the window. Edsel was born in 1893, just as his father was tinkering with his first engine on a kitchen table. He grew up watching the empire rise from nothing. But while Henry was obsessed with function, gears, and pistons, Edsel was obsessed with beauty. Edsel was gentle. He was artistic. He loved painting, he loved design, and he loved people. He was a man of immense grace and kindness, described by everyone who met him as a true gentleman. He didn't have his father's sharp edges. He didn't have that rural, suspicious chip on his shoulder. He was sophisticated. He understood art. He understood style. And he understood that a car needed to be more than just a box on wheels. It needed to be beautiful. In any other family, Edsel would have been celebrated. He was brilliant in his own way. He was the one who pushed for better designs, who understood modern advertising, who actually knew how to talk to the workers without threatening them. But in the Ford family, Edsel's gentleness was seen as a fatal flaw. To Henry Ford, Edsel was a problem that needed to be fixed. Henry looked at his sensitive, artistic son and saw weakness. He saw a boy who had been raised with too much comfort, too much wealth. Henry believed that struggle was the only thing that made a man. He had fought his way up from poverty, fighting bankers and competitors every step of the way. Edsel had been born at the finish line, and Henry was terrified, genuinely terrified, that Edsel was too soft to run the empire. He feared that once he was gone, the sharks of Wall Street would eat his gentle son alive. So, Henry Ford made a decision that would shape the history of the company and doom the happiness of his family. He decided that he wasn't just going to be Edsel's father. He was going to be his creator. He was going to toughen him up. He was going to hammer the softness out of the boy, just like he hammered steel in the Rouge plant. This wasn't abuse in the traditional physical sense. It was something far more psychological, far more insidious. It was a campaign of systematic humiliation that lasted for decades. It started when Edsel was young. Henry would give him a toy, watch him play with it, and then snatch it away or break it, just to teach him that nothing lasts. As Edsel grew older and entered the business, the tactics became public. In 1919, Henry Ford did something that shocked the world. He resigned as president of the Ford Motor Company. He announced that he was retiring to Fairlane to spend time with his birds and his history projects. He handed the crown to Edsel. At just 25 years old, Edsel Ford became the president of the largest company on earth. The press cheered. They called it a new era. Edsel, with his bright eyes and stylish suits, looked like the future. He moved into his own estate, Gawkler Point, a beautiful house on the shores of Lake St. Clair. It was a house filled with light, art, and the laughter of his own growing family. He wanted to modernize the company. He wanted to replace the old Model T, which had been in production for over a decade and was becoming obsolete. He wanted to introduce hydraulic brakes, new colors, new comforts. But he quickly realized that his presidency was a sham. Henry hadn't retired, he had just moved to the shadows. From the stone library at Fair Lane, Henry was still pulling every string. He had set a trap for his son. He wanted to see if Edsel would fight back. Every time Edsel made a decision, Henry would undermine it. If Edsel ordered a new building to be constructed, Henry would drive by the next day and order it to be torn down, just to show everyone who was really in charge. If Edsel promoted a talented executive, Henry would fire him. There is a famous story from the engineering labs. Edsel had been working secretly on a new prototype. He wanted to show his father that they could build a 6-cylinder engine, something smoother and more powerful than the old 4-cylinder engines Henry loved. Edsel and his engineers spent months perfecting it. When it was finished, they mounted it on a stand, gleaming and perfect. Henry walked into the room. He didn't say a word. He walked up to the engine, looked at it, and then started kicking it. He kicked the delicate machinery with his heavy boots until parts snapped and bent. Then he turned around and walked out. The message was clear. Do not try to be smarter than me. For Edsel, Fair Lane wasn't a home. It was the headquarters of the opposition. Every Sunday, Edsel was expected to drive from his home at Gawkler Point to have dinner with his parents at Fair Lane. These dinners were excruciating. The atmosphere in the dining room was heavy enough to crush a man. The lighting was dim, Edison's bulbs casting long shadows against the dark wood paneling. The food was simple, often boiled vegetables and soybean concoctions that Henry was experimenting with. At the table, Henry would openly mock Edsel. He would criticize his clothes, calling them too fancy. He would criticize his lifestyle, making fun of Edsel's high society friends in Grosse Pointe. He would criticize Edsel's management style in front of the servants, and Edsel would just sit there. He would smile politely. He would nod. He loved his father. He worshipped him, and that love was the chain that held him down. He couldn't fight back because he was desperate for the one thing Henry refused to give him: approval. The tragedy was that they were a perfect team if only Henry could have seen it. Henry was the raw power. Edsel was the refinement. Henry built the engine. Edsel built the body. The Model A, the car that saved the company in the late 1920s, was a product of their collaboration. Henry did the mechanics. Edsel did the styling. It was a masterpiece. But Henry couldn't share the credit. He resented that people liked Edsel's design more than his engine. As the 1930s approached, the darkness at Fair Lane deepened. The Great Depression hit America like a sledgehammer. Car sales collapsed. The workers who had worshipped Henry Ford began to starve. The benevolent dictatorship of the early years turned into a police state. And Henry, aging and increasingly paranoid, decided that Edsel's gentle approach was dangerous. He believed the company needed muscle. He believed it needed a weapon. And so he brought a new figure into the family dynamic, a man who would become the villain of this story, a man who had no interest in cars, no interest in engineering, and no interest in business, a man who was hired for one reason only: he was brutal. His name was Harry Bennett, and when he entered the gates of the Ford Empire, the psychological war between father and son turned into a battle for survival. Harry Bennett was not a car guy. He didn't know how a transmission worked, and he didn't care. He was a former Navy sailor, a former boxer, and a man who communicated with his fists rather than memos. He was short, stocky, and had a face that looked like it had been rearranged in a few too many bar fights. He always wore a bow tie, which made him look harmless, but it was a calculated deception. He was the most dangerous man in Detroit. He met Henry Ford by accident in the 1920s. The story goes that Bennett was involved in a street brawl, fighting off several men at once. Henry Ford happened to be driving by, stopped his car, and watched. He admired the way this little man fought dirty to win. Henry, who was becoming increasingly paranoid about communists, gangsters, and labor unions, decided right then and there, I need a man like that. Henry hired him initially for security, but Bennett quickly realized that his real job wasn't guarding the factory gates. His real job was guarding Henry Ford's mind. He became the old man's eyes and ears. He became the son Henry wished he had. While Edsel wanted to talk about art and engineering, Bennett wanted to talk about enemies. He fed Henry's paranoia, whispering in his ear that everyone was out to get him. Everyone, including his own son. By the 1930s, Harry Bennett had risen to become the head of the Ford Service Department. The name sounds boring, bureaucratic, almost helpful. It was anything but. The service department was essentially a private army. At its peak, Bennett commanded over 3,000 men. These weren't security guards. They were ex-convicts, boxers, wrestlers, and former gang members that Bennett had recruited from the underworld. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore suits and fedoras, walking the factory floors of the River Rouge plant with dead eyes and heavy pockets. The atmosphere in the Ford empire changed overnight. The Crystal Palace of industry became a fortress of fear. Workers stopped talking to each other on the assembly line. You never knew if the man screwing in the bolt next to you was a spy for Bennett. If you complained about the speed of the line, you were fired. If you were caught talking about a union, you were beaten in the parking lot. But Bennett's favorite target wasn't the workers. It was Edsel Ford. This is where the family dynamic turns into a psychological horror story. Henry Ford gave Harry Bennett unofficial power over the entire company. He gave this uneducated thug more authority than the company president, and he did it specifically to break Edsel's spirit. Imagine Edsel's life. He would arrive at his office in the morning, ready to run the company. He would issue an order, perhaps approving a new design for a fender or authorizing a purchase of steel. An hour later, Harry Bennett would walk in, put his feet up on Edsel's desk and say, "Your father doesn't like that idea. We're canceling it." Edsel would drive to Fairlane to confront his father. "Father," he would say, "Bennett is countermanding my orders. He is humiliating me in front of the staff." And Henry? Henry would just shrug. He would look at his son with those cold blue eyes and say, "Harry knows what I want. You should listen to Harry. He's tough. You could learn something from him." It was a test. Henry was waiting for Edsel to explode. He wanted Edsel to punch Bennett in the face. He wanted Edsel to fire him, to scream, to show some guts. But Edsel couldn't do it. That wasn't who he was. Edsel was a diplomat. He believed in rules, in hierarchy, in decency. He couldn't understand a man like Bennett, who operated purely on chaos and violence. So Edsel retreated. He swallowed the humiliation. He absorbed the stress, and the stress began to eat him alive from the inside out. The situation reached its breaking point with the Battle of the Overpass. This is a famous moment in American history, but it's usually told as a labor story. In reality, it was the moment Edsel Ford realized he had lost his father completely. It was May 26, 1937. The United Auto Workers, UAW Union, was trying to organize the Ford workers. Edsel, privately, was sympathetic. He understood the world was changing. He told his father, "We should talk to them. We should negotiate. It's the modern way." Henry Ford refused. "We will never recognize the union," he declared. "I built this company, and nobody is going to tell me how to run it." He told Harry Bennett to take care of it. Union organizers, led by a man named Walter Reuther, gathered on a pedestrian overpass outside the River Rouge plant. They were there legally, planning to hand out leaflets. They brought photographers. They wanted a peaceful demonstration. Suddenly, the doors of the factory burst open. A group of men from Harry Bennett's service department charged onto the overpass. They weren't there to talk. They pulled jackets over their heads to hide their faces and attacked the organizers. It was brutal. Reuther and his colleagues were kicked downstairs, beaten, and thrown against concrete walls. The photographers captured everything. The next day, the pictures were on the front page of every newspaper in America. The Ford Motor Company, once the symbol of American hope, was now seen as a brutal dictatorship. Edsel Ford was devastated. He was a man who cared deeply about his reputation and the family name. He saw those photos and felt a profound sense of shame. He went to his father again, pleading with him, "Father, this has to stop. The government is going to step in. The public hates us. Bennett is destroying everything you built." Henry Ford didn't care about the public. He didn't care about the government. He looked at Edsel and accused him of being weak. "You're on their side," Henry sneered. "You're soft." Harry handled it the way a man handles it. Fair Lane, the stone castle on the river, became a silent war zone. Edsel stopped arguing. He realized that words were useless. His father was living in a different reality, a reality guarded by Harry Bennett. Edsel began to fade. The stress of the daily battles, the humiliation, and the constant fear of what Bennett would do next began to manifest physically. Edsel developed severe stomach pains. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He grew thin and pale. The doctors diagnosed him with severe ulcers. They told him he needed rest. He needed to get away from the source of the stress, but he couldn't leave. He felt a massive responsibility to the company, to the workers, and, tragically, to his father. He believed that if he left, Bennett would take over completely and destroy the company entirely. Edsel stayed to protect the legacy, even as the legacy was killing him. Meanwhile, Harry Bennett was living like a king. He built his own castle, a bizarre structure in Ypsilanti called the Castle. It was designed like a fortress, with secret passages, lion cages, yes, he kept pet lions and tigers, and thick walls to stop bullets. He carried a .45 caliber pistol at all times. He would shoot cigarettes out of his guests' mouths for fun. Bennett began to see himself as the true heir. He started telling people that he was going to take over when the old man died. He openly mocked Edsel in meetings. "The little prince," he called him. The dynamic at the Ford dinner table became unbearable. Henry's wife, Clara Ford, watched this happen with growing horror. She loved her husband, but she adored her son. She tried to intervene, begging Henry to be kinder, to get rid of Bennett. But Henry was deaf to her pleas. He was convinced that he was saving Edsel. He truly believed that by putting Edsel through this hell, he was forging him into steel. "I'm making a man out of him," Henry would tell people. "He'll thank me later." But there would be no later. By the early 1940s, the world was at war. World War II had begun. The U.S. government needed Ford to build bombers and tanks. They needed the massive power of the Rouge plant. But the government was terrified. They saw an old, senile Henry Ford surrounded by thugs, refusing to cooperate, refusing to sign contracts, paralyzed by paranoia. Washington looked to Edsel. They knew he was the sane one. They knew he was the patriot. Edsel stepped up. Despite his failing health, despite the pain in his stomach that was now constant, Edsel threw himself into the war effort. He spearheaded the construction of the Willow Run bomber plant, a factory so big it had its own weather system. He worked 16-hour days. He fought Bennett and his father for every inch of progress, pushing to convert the car factories into an arsenal of democracy. He was fighting 2 wars at once, one against the Axis powers in Europe and one against his father in Dearborn. The strain was too much for any human body to bear. The ulcers turned into something worse. The pain became agonizing, but Edsel hid it. He didn't want his father to see him suffering, because suffering was weakness. He kept working, kept smiling, kept showing up to the dinners at Fair Lane, pale as a ghost, trying to be the good son. In 1942, the diagnosis changed. It wasn't just ulcers, it was stomach cancer. But even then, the tragedy deepened. When Henry Ford was told that his son was dying, he refused to believe it. He literally refused to accept the medical diagnosis. He accused the doctors of lying. He accused Edsel of faking it to get sympathy. "It's not cancer," Henry shouted. "It's his lifestyle. It's his nerves. He just needs to toughen up. He needs to stop listening to those doctors and get back to work." Henry Ford forbade Edsel from having surgery. He ordered him to change his diet, to eat the raw vegetables and soybeans that Henry believed were the cure for everything. Edsel, the dutiful son to the very end, listened. He didn't get the surgery. He went home to Gawkler Point, laid down in his bed, and prepared to die. The stage was set for the final act. The prince was dying, the king was in denial, and the dragon, Harry Bennett, was sharpening his knives, ready to seize the throne. The walls of Fair Lane were about to witness the ultimate price of the Ford ambition. By 1943, the situation at Gawkler Point, Edsel Ford's private estate, had turned grim. The prince of the empire was dying. The years of psychological warfare, the constant undermining by Harry Bennett, and the brutal pressure of managing war contracts had destroyed his body. At only 49 years old, Edsel weighed less than 120 pounds. He was unable to eat, ravaged by what was officially diagnosed as stomach cancer, though many around him believed it was the physical manifestation of a broken heart. Even in these final months, the disconnect between father and son remained absolute. Henry Ford visited Gawkler Point, but he refused to accept the reality of the situation. He did not trust the medical diagnosis. To him, illness was a sign of wrong living, not biology. He suggested that Edsel simply needed to change his diet or work harder to clear his system. The tragedy was that Edsel, conditioned by a lifetime of seeking approval, could not fight back. He faded away in the quiet luxury of his room, the sounds of the lake outside offering the only peace he could find. On May 26, 1943, Edsel Ford died. It was a date loaded with dark irony. Exactly 6 years to the day after the Battle of the Overpass, the event that had publicly humiliated him and solidified Harry Bennett's power. The news shattered the Ford workforce. Thousands of employees lined up to pay respects to the man they viewed as the company's conscience. But at Fair Lane, the reaction was cold. Henry Ford received the news with a stoic, almost detached demeanor. He did not weep publicly. He simply absorbed the loss and immediately turned his attention to the survival of the dynasty. With Edsel gone, the Ford Motor Company entered its most dangerous phase. Henry Ford, now 80 years old and showing clear signs of mental decline, reappointed himself as president. It was a disaster. The company was losing nearly $10 million a month. Accounts were in disarray, and the massive government war contracts were at risk of failing. In Washington, D.C., the Roosevelt administration watched with growing alarm. There were serious discussions in the White House about nationalizing the Ford Motor Company, seizing it from the family to ensure the production of bombers and tanks did not stop. The American industrial icon was teetering on the edge of ruin. Inside the company, Harry Bennett was poised to take control. He had the old man's ear, he had the private army, and he had the ambition. He began maneuvering to sideline the Ford family entirely, believing that after Henry's death, the empire would belong to him. But the salvation of the company did not come from the boardroom. It came from the two women who had lived in the shadows of the immense Ford ego, Henry's wife Clara and Edsel's widow Eleanor. For decades, they had watched the tragedy unfold from the sidelines. Eleanor Ford had watched her husband be systematically crushed by his father's expectations and Bennett's bullying. Now, she saw the same forces threatening her son, Henry Ford II. The grief over Edsel's death hardened into a cold resolve. She realized that if she did not act, the legacy her husband had died for would be stolen by a former boxer with a bow tie. The confrontation was quiet, private, and lethal. Eleanor Ford, backed by Clara, delivered an ultimatum to the aging patriarch. The message was simple. Henry Ford had to abdicate. He had to step down and allow his grandson, Henry Ford II, to take the presidency. If he refused, Eleanor threatened to sell her massive block of stock. Clara, in a move that shocked Henry, agreed. She told her husband she would sell her shares as well. It was the one threat Henry Ford could not ignore. Selling the stock meant the company would go public. It meant Wall Street bankers and investors would take control of the family business. Faced with the combined will of the women in his life, the stubborn industrialist finally broke. He agreed to step aside. The transfer of power was swift. In September 1945, Henry Ford II took the helm. He was 28 years old, heavy-set like his grandfather, but with the softer eyes of his father. He had been serving in the Navy, pulled back to save the family business. He entered a company that was rotting from the inside, ruled by fear and secret police. He knew exactly what had to be done. His first major act was to remove the tumor that had been growing in the company for 30 years. He summoned Harry Bennett to his office. The meeting was short. There were no negotiations. Henry II fired the man who had terrified his father. Bennett, realizing his power had evaporated the moment the old man stepped down, left the building. He burned his files in his basement office and departed the Rouge complex forever. The service department was dismantled. The era of fear was over. Henry Ford, stripped of his title and his influence, retreated permanently to Fair Lane. The last years of his life were spent in the quiet isolation of the limestone fortress. He wandered the grounds, watching the river, obsessing over his historical village, Greenfield Village. He stopped using the modern cars he had built and began using a horse-drawn carriage again, a final rejection of the modern world he had created. The end came in April 1947. A massive spring storm battered Dearborn, causing the Rouge River to flood its banks. The waters rose higher than they had in decades, swamping the estate's grounds. The floodwaters reached the massive powerhouse, the cathedral of electricity Henry had built to keep himself independent from the world. The turbines stopped. The power went out. Inside the stone castle, the richest man in history lay in his bed, dying. The central heating failed. The electric lights failed. The servants were forced to light oil lamps and candles to see him. On the night of April 7th, 1947, Henry Ford died. The man who had electrified the planet, the man who had changed the course of human history with mass production, left the world exactly as he had entered it, in a cold, dark room, illuminated only by the flickering flame of a candle. Fair Lane stands today as a monument to this complex, tragic history. It is a national historic landmark, a somber stone giant hidden in the trees. It does not have the festive party atmosphere of other Gilded Age mansions. It feels heavier. It carries the weight of the silence that existed between a father and a son. The Ford family retained control. Henry Ford II saved the company, modernizing it and leading it into the second half of the century. But the cost of that survival is etched into the history of the estate. They built the engine that drove the American dream, but in the process, the machinery of their own ambition crushed the heart of the family. The story of Fair Lane is a reminder that you can conquer the market. You can amass a fortune that rivals nations, but you cannot engineer a happy family. Some things, once broken, cannot be fixed on an assembly line.